Hello and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Ed Miller. I'm a project manager in operating reactor licensing. Today's meeting is a public comment gathering meeting to solicit input from stakeholders on how the NRC implements Executive Order 14300. Specifically, today's meeting is regarding Section 5B of the Executive Order, which directs the NRC to reconsider reliance on the linear no threshold model, radiation exposure, and the as low as reasonably achievable standard.
All right, next speaker is Mr. Daniel Hirsch. Mr. Hirsch, I'm going to make you a presenter here and give you the opportunity to check your sound and your camera if you want. Okay, Mr. Hirsch, you should be able to control your microphone and your camera. You have to unmute yourself to speak. Let's give him a minute to troubleshoot. Okay. Mr. Hirsch? I think we can hear you.
I am grayed out. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, and we can see your video now.
Ed, you can hear me?
We can hear you fine, and we can see you, and your title slide is showing.
Thank you.
Go ahead and start your presentation when you're ready.
Thanks so much. My name is Daniel Hirsch. I'm the retired director of the Program on Environmental and Nuclear Policy at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and president of the Committee to Bridge the Gap. So I'm going to disclose the dirty little secret at the heart of the Nuclear Executive Order. It could result in allowing radiation exposures to the public 100 to 1,000 times higher than permitted today. Radiation at those levels is estimated to cause cancer in about 4 out of 5 people exposed. The executive order states, and I quote, "The NRC utilizes safety models that posit there is no safe threshold of radiation exposure and that harm is directly proportional to the amount of exposure." And that's true. It goes on to say those models lack sound scientific basis and produce irrational results, such as requiring that nuclear plants protect against radiation below naturally occurring levels. And that's not true. The EO thus flies in the face of more than half a century of findings from the National Academy of Sciences and virtually all other international scientific bodies. Indeed, radiation risk estimates per unit dose have generally increased over time. The National Academy's BEER 5 study had risk estimates that were 3 to 18 times higher than BEER 3, and the BEER 7 excess cancer risk estimate is a further 35% larger than BEER 5. As recently as 4 years ago, the NRC itself, citing the scientific consensus, strongly rejected petitions for rulemaking to reject LNT. And here we are again, basically being told to reverse. Recent high-quality studies such as the International Workers Study and EPCT have further reinforced LNT, confirmed cancer risk in the low-dose range, and in fact found low-dose cancer risk greater than one would presume from extrapolating from A-bomb survivors who were exposed to higher doses. The INWORKS research, for example, found excess relative rates for solid cancer mortality at low doses, quote, larger than estimates currently informing radiation protection, unquote. In other words, standards are not strong enough. Furthermore, NRC regulations, of course, do not require exposures be below background as claimed by the EO. The NRC regulations require that the dose be kept to 0.1 rem in a year, exclusive of the dose contributions from background radiation. And background radiation is, of course, far from harmless. The National Academy's risk factors indicate that about 10 million of the current US population will get cancer from background radiation. Adding to that exposure adds to the risks. So what would be the public health impact if the regulations based on the linear and no threshold model were overturned? The LNT petition for rulemaking that the NRC rejected in 2021 proposed increasing permissible worker doses to 10 rem per year and increasing public exposures to the same amount. Anti-LNT advocates generally claim a low dose threshold of 10 rem. So what does that mean in terms of the public can understand? If dose limits for the public were increased to 10 rem a year, that would be the equivalent of 5,000 chest x-rays each year from conception to death. That would be 100 to 1,000 times higher than current permissible limits. 10 rem a year would be 100 times higher than the current NRC limit of 100 millirem a year. It would be about 1,000 times higher than the current EPA limit for cleanup of contaminated sites and about 1,000 times the current EPA and NRC limits for public exposures from nuclear fuel cycle facilities. So here's the key risk figure for addressing the adequacy of radiation protection limits. 1.17 times 10 to the minus 3 cancers per person rem at what are considered low doses. This comes from the National Academy of Sciences Beer 7 report that was commissioned by NRC, EPA, and DOE. The official figure from EPA is essentially the same number, 1.16 times 10 to the minus 3. So in plain language, there's a little bit more than one cancer produced per 1,000 people exposed to 1 rem. 10 rem per year over a lifetime would thus result in an excess cancer, put your seatbelt on, in more than 80% of the people exposed. It's a hugely unacceptable risk. The EPA acceptable cancer risk range for exposure to carcinogens is 1 in a million to 1 in 10,000. If linear no threshold model and the regulations based thereon are thrown out and replaced with a so-called low dose threshold of 10 rem per year, the risk to members of the public at such exposures would be nearly 10,000 to 1 million times higher than the acceptable risk range. So NRC radiation regulations should be changed, but they should be markedly tightened. Current public limits are 35 years old, and worker limits are 2/3 of a century old, established in 1960, not modernized since. In finalizing the current regulations in 1991, the NRC noted that BEER 5 had come out after the proposed rule, and it substantially increased radiation risk per unit dose. But NRC declined to tighten the permissible exposures accordingly. Even decades ago, the NRC conceded its radiation limits produce risks higher than standard allowable risks, and the situation has only gotten worse since then. The National Academy and EPA cancer risk estimates for the current worker dose limits that the NRC has and DOE is that 1 in 5 workers would get cancer at the exposures allowed under the regulations. That's 5,000 millirem a year, equivalent to 10 chest x-rays every day you work. Over a working life from age 18 to 65, that would yield a risk of excess cancer of approximately 1 in 5, according to BEER 7 and EPA. In other words, if 100 workers began nuclear employment and received the radiation each year at the permissible level, 20 of them would be predicted to get cancer from their occupational exposure. This is grossly non-protective. NRC radiation limits for the public are far outside the acceptable risk limits for any other carcinogen. The BEER 7 and EPA risk coefficients indicate that the current regulatory permissible dose for the public of 100 millirem per year received over a lifetime result in a cancer in approximately 1 out of every 100 people exposed. That's 100 to 10,000 times outside the standard acceptable risk range for all carcinogens. The EPA famously put it a few years ago, to put it bluntly, radiation should not be treated as a privileged pollutant. You and I should not be exposed to higher risks from radiation sites than we should be from sites which had contained any other environmental pollutant. So what would be the real world effects if LNT and the regulations derived therefrom were abandoned? Cleanup of contaminated sites around the country would almost completely stop. Cleanup would be abandoned at numerous highly contaminated Superfund sites that are part of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex. For example, Hanford, Los Alamos, and Oak Ridge. Cleanup obligations would be voided for abandoned uranium mines on tribal lands such as Navajo Nation. Former Manhattan Project contamination, such as the Westlake facility in Missouri, would never be cleaned up. And decommissioned nuclear plants would be able to leave much of their radioactive contamination and just walk away. Additionally, such a change would allow massively increased radioactive releases from nuclear power plants. It would eliminate most controls for radioactive releases into air, rivers, lakes, and oceans. It would authorize high-level waste repositories even if projected doses from leakage far exceed current limits. So the executive order to gut radiation protection should cause great concern for both critics and supporters of nuclear power. Critics should worry about the harm that would result from extreme increases in permissible radiation exposures to the public. And supporters of nuclear expansion should worry that massively weakening radiation protection standards will damage prospects for public support, since it demonstrates that nuclear plants can't operate unless allowed to expose the public to unacceptable radiation levels. Conclusion: radiation protection standards should be markedly strengthened, not gutted. Thank you.